Hey everyone, I'm OM System Ambassador Chris McGinnis. I'm here in the event space at Adorama in New York City. We've got a group here, we've got a group online, so hi to everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about small subjects, big results, and I'm saying we're going to do that the easy way with OM System, which is my brand of choice. So let's get started. So first up, I have this quote here from Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is actually best known for his work in street photography. We're talking about macro photography today, but I really thought that this quote, in photography, the smallest thing can be a great subject. And that's really how I approach photography. I almost exclusively specialize in macro photography, and my subjects are really small, but I like to present them in a great way. And here are some of those small things which I consider to be great subjects. So for the next 45 minutes, hour, I'm going to talk to you all about my work, how I achieve the results, the gear that I use, things like that. Specifically, today's key objectives will be to discover the OM System advantage. So the gear that I use is made by OM System, and I think there's some real advantages to that system for macro and the type of macro that I do. To learn the meaning of one-to-one macro. What is true macro photography and what does one-to-one mean? Understanding the basic functions of focus bracketing and focus stacking. A lot of people have heard those terms. Some people think that they're the same thing. I'm going to try to demystify that for everyone and clarify what they are. And then, of course, I'm going to give you tips. I'm going to give you tips that regardless of what system you shoot with, even if you don't shoot macro, I think some of them will be applicable and you can take them away right away and put them into good use. And a quick rundown specifically, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm up here talking to you, define one-to-one macro, talk quite a bit about magnification and how it pertains to macro, tell you about that OM System advantage, cover all of my gear. We're really going to get into depth of field and how to manage depth of field for macro, give you my exact camera settings, the baseline that I start with every time I turn on my camera. As mentioned, hit on focus bracketing and stacking, what they are, why you would do it, how you do it, show you some sample photos, and then we'll finish with those tips. All right, first about me. So I was born and raised in New Jersey, not all that far from here in New York City. I've lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for the last 25 years. That's where I went to college, and that's where I reside now. My education is in graphic design, and most of my career has been in graphic design. But I'm an OM System Ambassador photographer. So my photography, as mentioned, is really all about macro and in the field, finding subjects in their natural locations and taking photos of them there. And I've been doing that since about 2016. So for about 8 years, that's really been my area of specialty. So I mentioned one-to-one macro. And one-to-one macro is also what we'll use to define officially what macro photography is. So some people confuse close-up photography with macro photography, or some people get real bent out of shape like, oh, that's not actually macro because it's not one-to-one. But what does all that actually mean? So one-to-one macro is when you have your subject, and we'll call that one, and we have our sensor. So you see inside the camera behind the mount, there's a sensor. That's one. They're each a size, right? Whatever size sensor you use, whatever size subject you have, each one represents one. When you put them together at real size, the ratio is 1-to-1. The magnification is 1 times what it is in real life, okay? So even if I show photos today that aren't truly at 1-to-1 or greater than 1-to-1 magnification, for the sake of this presentation, we're going to call everything macro, but know that there is a difference, and I understand the difference, now you understand the difference, but we're going to call everything macro. But we're going to get into a little bit more of those specifics about magnification, and hopefully if that was confusing to you at all or didn't make any sense, I think I'll be able to clarify it for you in just a second. So I mentioned that you have your subject and you have your sensor. But there's different size sensors for different cameras. And 3 of the most popular sensors are up on the screen here. There's others, right? There's medium format sensors, and there's all kinds of different sensors, smaller and larger. But you have cameras with a full frame sensor, cameras with an APS-C sensor, and cameras with a 4/3 sensor. So these are three of the most popular on the market. Many brands use full frame sensors. A lot of those brands also have APS-C options, which are a little bit smaller. And then you have brands like OM System that use this 4/3 sensor. That sensor is roughly half the size of a full frame sensor, and therefore the output looks twice the size. And it's all because of that ratio of subject size to sensor size. And this is really important when we're talking about macro, because that dime that you see on the bottom of each column, that's the same size in real life, right? Like a dime is a dime is a dime. It's about 19 millimeters across. But when you have a sensor that's 36 millimeters across, 1-to-1 magnification yields you a result that only fills half of your sensor, roughly, right? But on 4/3 on the right, it fills the entire sensor. So that result, even though they're both 1-to-1 magnification, looks much bigger and more magnified. So I'm going to get into that OM System advantage in a minute, but this is one of those things, is that appearance of much more magnified. And when we're shooting macro, we want as much magnification as we can get, right? That's what makes these really engaging, eye-popping images. So now this is where it gets a little technical, and I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. A, because I want to get to the stuff that's a little more fun, and B, I don't want anybody to fall asleep. But I do want to show you that we have other magnification ratios. It's not just 1-to-1. You can have a fourth or a half or a whole, which is 1-to-1. So with my sensor, the 4/3 sensor in my OM System camera, we're talking about 17, 18 millimeters across. And at 1-to-4, we've got a 70 millimeter field of view. So 4 times the size of the sensor. Those are all millimeters, each of those little boxes on the screen. And the dime fills up that much space. So at 1-to-4 magnification, my dime looks that big. If I was to go to half magnification, the dime would look that big, 1-to-2. And then, as you saw in the sensor magnification chart, 1-to-1 magnification, and I've chosen a dime because it's really close to the exact size of the sensor, you see that it fills the entire space of that sensor. So this is one-time magnification, 1-to-1 ratio, 1x magnification. The dime is like 18 or 19 millimeters across. My sensor is between 17 and 18 millimeters across. So you see just the edges are cut off. But this is the maximum magnification that I can achieve with a 1-to-1 lens. You can go beyond 1-to-1. My 90 macro, which is here, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, can actually magnify results up to 2 times. That is 2-to-1 magnification. So now our field of view is half the size of the sensor, and the result looks like this. Okay? So this is no teleconverters, no extension tubes, no what do they call them? Like a Raynox adapter like I have here. So nothing else. This is just the lens on its own is capable of this magnification. And then to compare them all, you see 1/4, 1/2, whole, and double. Okay? So I say this up front so we can understand. There's not going to be any test. There's not going to be any expectation that you know these ratios. But just so you know what people mean when they talk about 1-to-1, oh, that's less than 1-to-1, or this is beyond 1-to-1. That's kind of the takeaway here. And you can go beyond 1-to-1 in a couple of different ways. So I mentioned the Raynox adapter. This is not an OM System product. This is a third-party product. This works on virtually any lens for any camera. And it just clips onto the end of your lens, like this. And it's like a fancy magnifying glass that magnifies the results. Okay? It's very inexpensive. I'm sure Adorama has them available. They're a really great way to kind of like tiptoe into the world of macro. They're also great to extend the magnification of an existing macro lens, like the 60 macro that I have on there. With the 90, I honestly feel like it doesn't work great with the 90 and it's not necessary, but on the 60 it's really good. You can also go with extension tubes like you see on the right. I don't have extension tubes here today. I don't really like them, but I know that they're popular, so I want to mention them. They are spacers that go behind your lens. So unlike the Raynox, which goes over the glass, the extension tubes go behind the lens in front of the sensor, move your lens glass further away, and that magnifies the image on your sensor more, and you get very similar results. But as you can see, for me, the convenience for like a Raynox adapter wins. The results are very similar. So the convenience wins with the Raynox. And then I just want to talk about the working distance that you need to be at to get magnification. And I think that a lot of people either don't consider this or don't understand it. Maybe they buy a macro lens, whether it's an OM system macro lens or somebody else's, and they're not getting results that are as magnified as they would like. You know, they see other people on social media and they see, oh, these results are awesome, I'm gonna buy that lens. Why don't my images look like that? I can't get so magnified. The magnification output is directly tied to how far away from your subject you are. So most macro lenses are a fixed focal length. So like this is the 60 macro. Here is the 90 macro. To zoom, I need to move in and out. That's my zoom. There's no extension and collapse of the lens, right? But to get to 1:1, or whatever the lens's maximum magnification is, I need to move to its minimum working distance. Now, that might be foreign to you. Every lens manufacturer publishes the specs for every lens they make, and the minimum working distance will be listed. If it's not the minimum working distance, the minimum focusing distance. The difference is working distance is the space from subject to the end of the lens. That's how much space you have to work in. Focusing distance is from the subject to the sensor in your camera. Okay? So those are the specs that you want to look for, and that'll tell you how far away you have to be to achieve the result that you're envisioning. And I have just a quick illustration here. So this is the 90 macro, and to get 1x or 1:1 magnification, my glass needs to be about 3 3/4 away from my subject. So people see my photos and they'll say, oh, how far away did you have to be from that spider? Well, about that far, okay? Now the 90 can actually magnify to 2x, 2:1. I need to get 2 5/8 inches away. So if I'm using this camera and I'm focusing on this, I need to be here, okay? So it's pretty close. And I know this has the diffuser on it, so maybe it's a little harder to see. Here, it's about the same, so it's this distance away. So if you've got a macro lens and you don't understand why my results aren't magnified, you're probably not coming up on that minimum working distance where you're going to get maximum magnification. And with the 90 macro, it is compatible with teleconverters, which I didn't mention teleconverters when I said Raynox, extension tubes. A teleconverter also goes behind the lens like a extension tube would, but a teleconverter has glass in it, and it's magnifying the result as well. So you might be familiar with teleconverters maybe for wildlife photography or telephoto. They are compatible with the 90, which is over here now. But you'll notice that the camera just moves back. That minimum working distance stays the same. All right, so now just one slide. I'll talk to it for a minute, but I do want to cover what I consider to be the advantages of OM system for macro. So I shoot OM system. I have for years. I love it. You know, I'm an OM system ambassador. Okay, of course this guy's going to talk about OM system, but if you go out on social media and you look for macro photos, you're really going to see a lot of photographers shooting with OM, and I think some of these reasons are probably why. The cameras are weather sealed, the lenses are weather sealed, the flashes are weather sealed. So when you're out in the field and you're looking for insects and spiders and crawling around, or you're in the rainforest, being weather sealed is a huge advantage. You can go down to cold temperatures, you can go out in the pouring rain. The system's really small and lightweight. I mean, this is a very tiny rig that is very powerful. 5-axis in-camera image stabilization, that is some of the best in the industry. Again, that's attributed to the 4/3 sensor. So that sensor is smaller, has a little bit more room to move around. That can stabilize your results a little bit more than some bigger sensor competition. Dedicated macro lenses, I've got 2 of them here, 90, 60. I also have the 30 macro. I'll talk about these individually in just a minute. In-camera focus bracketing and focus stacking. OM has automated these two features, which are huge advantages for macro photographers. More depth of field versus full frame. Some people say, more depth of field, I want bokeh, right? Like, I want f1.2 and I want everything out of focus. Well, I'll talk in a couple minutes about why you want the opposite with macro, and getting enough depth of field is a challenge. This is actually an advantage of the smaller sensor camera. More magnification, I mentioned already. Easy to use wireless app, which is great, especially you're in the field, you can't wait to get something on Instagram. You can zip it to your phone, send it off to your social media of choice. Excellent in-camera JPEG reproduction. I know that everyone's gonna say, I shoot in RAW, I don't need JPEG reproduction, but for certain features like in-camera stacking, you're going to get a JPEG result. Those JPEGs look great, and I'm gonna show you some examples that were JPEGs that were made in the cameras for focus stacks, and to me, they look just as good as the ones that I processed myself in Lightroom Photoshop. And then last but not least is savable, shareable custom settings. If you have a camera, whatever system you shoot with that offers a C1, C2, C3 on the mode dial, right? Maybe it just says 1, 2, 3, use those. Whatever you shoot, I don't care if you shoot macro or birds or wildlife or whatever else, those custom modes allow you to set default settings that will save you a ton of time. So the OM system cameras have it. The OM one has 4 custom modes. My C1, which is custom mode 1, is all of my macro settings. I turn the camera on and it's ready to shoot macro. My buttons are all changed, and I'm gonna show you all those specific settings. So, you can take a screenshot or take a photo of the screen behind me, and you can go home and map those settings yourself, and you'll be shooting the exact same way that I do, if you want to. But I encourage everyone to find the settings that work for you for the photography that you like. All right, so some specifics about my gear. It's up here on the table. I've mentioned it a little bit, but really my essentials are a camera, a lens, and a flash. And the camera, lens, and flash of choice for me are the OM1 Mark II, which is right here. I have the OM1 over here, previous generation. The 90mm macro, which is a pro-level macro lens capable of 2x magnification, as you saw, and a flash. And I like the FL700WR. It's a weather-sealed flash. It syncs up with the camera. It can automatically adjust its speed to the speed of my focus bracket or focus stack series, so I don't get blacked out frames. Everything's equally exposed automatically. It's a really, really nice feature. So these are the 3 that I would consider essential for my photography, but I'm going to show you a couple others in a second. And I'll hold this up on the screen for a minute. I won't talk about every single detail, but this is kind of the highlights of the OM1 Mark II. So if you're unfamiliar with OM system cameras, the features, these are some of the highlights, but of course I'm going to talk mostly about what's great for macro photography, and this is kind of everything, but I mentioned the in-camera focus bracketing and stacking, the weather sealing. These are things that are really helpful for me as a macro photographer. And then the 90 macro. There's a special place in my heart for this lens for a number of reasons. I was fortunate enough to be the first person to get to use this lens in the field about 2 years ago. So OM contacted me, said we've got a new lens coming out, and I got to go out and kind of trial the lens and capture sample output, which I have some of that output in this presentation today, and I immediately fell in love with it. It is everything that I wanted in a macro lens. It's like they delivered on every one of those bullet points. So it can magnify up to 2x natively. Remember, that's 2x on a 4/3 sensor. That looks like 4x on a full frame sensor. So you're getting much more magnified results than you can get with a 1-to-1 full frame lens. And then you can go up to 4x if you add a teleconverter, and that looks like 8x would look as far as the magnification on a full frame sensor. So we'll talk about full frame equivalent or 35mm equivalent, and we're just saying that the output looks as it would on those other systems. The weather sealing is great. It's IP53 weather sealed. It's really pretty light. When I first saw the lens, I was like, oh, it's a little bigger than I expected. And then I picked it up, I was like, oh, but it feels good. And really ergonomic. And when you're holding this lens versus the 60, which is small, you can really cradle it in a way which helps to get stable. So I feel really secure and stable, which is really helpful for the big bracketed series and stacks. And then even though I'm singing the praises of the 90 and I love it, I understand that it's a Pro Series lens, it's more expensive, it's a little bigger. So there are some other options. The 60 macro, which I used for many years and love, capable of 1-to-1 magnification. And then the 30 macro, which is actually capable of a little bit more than 1-to-1, about, I think it's 1.25 to 1. Super small, inexpensive, but I will say for insects and spiders, it is not my favorite because the working distance is very, very small. You need to be right up on top of your subject to get that magnification, and you end up scaring them away. There's not a lot of room for light to get in. So I don't use the 30 all that much, but it is great, especially if you're shooting jewelry or grains of sand or other things that you can get close to. So if you were choosing between the 60 and the 90, I have a couple of the kind of key decision points here. The 60, as you can see, ultra portable, super lightweight. It is capable of that 1x magnification. It cannot use teleconverters. So if you really want more magnification, you can't add teleconverters to this lens. It does not have image stabilization in the lens. Now the body does, but the lens itself does not. It does have a 1-to-1 shortcut. So on the side, there's a little dial. You can push that dial forward and you automatically go to 1-to-1 magnification. Just remember, if you're watching this or you're here today and you have a 60 and you're like, that 1-to-1 shortcut doesn't work for me. Remember, you have to be at the right working distance. Because if you hit the shortcut switch and then back up, once you autofocus, it's going to adjust and it's going to override what you just did. So if that's been tripping you up, that's probably why. And it does have moderate versatility. It can be used as a portrait lens or other things as well. The 90, of course, a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, double the magnification. It is compatible with teleconverters. It does have image stabilization. It has a manual focus clutch. So here I can pull back and move forward to engage manual focus physically or autofocus, which is really handy. And it's super versatile. I'm going to show some examples in the presentation in a few minutes where you can go from extreme close-up to a little wider to shooting something across the street, seconds apart. And then, as you can see here, I'm holding up this camera on my right with this big hood on it, right? So it looks like the Handmaid's Tale bonnet. It's a diffuser. So the diffuser softens my light from the flash before it hits my subject. It's no different than if you were in a studio and you have soft boxes and you have light modifiers, right? We want to do the same thing for our macro photos. This is the Cygnus Tech diffuser. So it's custom made by a photographer in Australia. He sells them online. On the left, you see my homemade softbox diffuser, so it doesn't cost anything. And similarly on the right, that's just a piece of packing foam with an elastic band. I always say some diffusion is better than no diffusion. So if you're just trying this out and getting your feet wet in macro and you want to see what it does, just grab a piece of foam out of a package that comes to your house and put it between your light and your subject. And I did mention all of these already, but these are what they look like, right? So on the left, you have a teleconverter. That is the 1.4 MC14. So that will magnify your results by 40%. The Raynox DCR 250, mentioned that. That's a magnifying glass that goes over your lens, and then extension tubes, which can go behind the lens. And I just put these here because everyone always wants to know what software I use, take my results from camera to final. I've been in the Adobe ecosystem for many, many, many years at this point, and Lightroom is where I do most of the work, Photoshop to kind of do heavier editing or finishing, and Helicon Soft's Helicon Focus for focus stacking. Okay, so a little bit earlier, I alluded to managing depth of field. And I was saying getting enough depth of field in macro is a challenge, where you might be thinking, portraits, I want just the front of the face in focus and everything else soft. But we have to remember that with macro, your working distance, as mentioned earlier, is very, very short. You're very close. And I think most photographers understand that basic of big aperture, small number, means shallow depth of field. Big number, small aperture, means more depth of field. So if you want a shallow depth of field, you use an f2.8 or f1.8, right? I think everybody generally knows that. But what we forget, or people tend to forget, is that distance from subject also has a direct impact on how much depth of field you have. And as you get closer to your subject, depth of field literally disappears, okay? So here on the screen, I have my subject here, which is my little mini camera, and I'm at f16. And at f16, I'm 18 inches away. Everything's pretty much in focus, right? Maybe some things are a little sharper than others, but pretty much in focus. Oh, we got a question up on the screen.
So is working distance basically your minimum focusing distance?
So the minimum focusing distance and minimum working distance are different. The minimum working distance is distance from subject to glass. Minimum focusing distance is distance from subject to sensor. But we're going to work toward that minimum distance. So in the next shot here, I get a little closer. My working distance, so distance from subject to glass, is 9 inches. Still at f16. My exposure is the same, right? But as you can tell, now things start to get softer. Just that lens, the plastic lens, is in focus, but the word Olympus at the top, the OMD letters, are soft. It's still f16, but I've moved. And then when I go even closer, so now I'm close to that minimum working distance, which is about 3 inches, 3 3/4 inches. I'm at 4.5 inches. Almost everything's soft. I'm still at f16. So sometimes people will say, oh, that 90 macro, I heard it's good, but it's f3.5. Like most pro lenses are f1.8 or something else. It's like, no. You want to shoot at those smaller apertures most of the time. Sometimes you'll go to the bigger apertures for certain reasons, but you need more depth of field. And then here they are side by side by side. And you can see the difference. As I get closer, magnification increases, depth of field decreases. Okay? Same aperture. We've taken that out of the equation. And then just to bring them all to the same size, you can see the difference. So on the left, f16, further back, everything looks pretty sharp. In the middle, a little closer, not so sharp. On the right, the lens is still sharp, but the word Olympus is totally soft, still at f16. So when I'm working with insects or spiders and I'm close up to them, I have to consider that. I'm really close, I'm only going to get so much in focus. And I mentioned that versatility of the 90, and I put that here because this is the same exact settings. f8, 100th of a second, ISO 200. These shots were made 2 seconds apart. The only thing that changed is my working distance. But I was able to get 2 very different looking shots with the same lens and the same settings. Speaking of settings, here's the part where you can take your screenshot and you're going to use the same settings as me and take the same photos I take. Is there a question?
Yeah, you got a question asking, where in the image is your first focus point when using focus stacking?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's where's my first focus point when I'm focus stacking? So I'll answer the question briefly now, but I'm going to get into it in a minute. When I want to focus stack, I'm going to start my focus at the front of the subject, the part that's nearest to me, and then my photos will move back into space. And I'll explain that in a few minutes, so remember that question. So my camera settings, I'm shooting in manual mode, 1/100th of a second. That might seem too slow for you. But remember, I'm using a flash. When you use a flash, you can shoot at shutter speeds significantly slower than you would think. Also, when I shoot with my silent shutter on my OMO Mark II, the maximum speed I can shoot at is 1/100th, NSYNC with a flash, so that's what I use as a default. Aperture, F8 to F10, I find on the 60 macro, I like F8. On the 90 macro, I like F10, but somewhere in that middle range. ISO's 200, single point autofocus, but I'm using back button focus. So my shutter button does not focus. I'm using a back button to do that. My drive mode is on sequential, so I'm able to hold the shutter button down, take multiple shots in a series. Simulated optical viewfinder. So depending on what camera manufacturer you have or even model, this is a feature that brightens the display. And the reason we need to do that, we all get used to seeing this kind of preview of our exposure before we shoot, which is great most of the time. But when you're using a flash, the camera is assessing the ambient light because your flash hasn't fired yet. So you need to consider, okay, I just need to compose my shot. In order to see it, I need some help. So your mode might be called Live View Boost. You could use night vision, which is an even more extreme version. Simulated optical viewfinder, but anything that your camera has, depending on manufacturer and model, to boost that view so you can actually see what you're doing. I don't need face detection on. I shoot in RAW. I leave my white balance at auto. Picture mode to natural. My image stabilization is on auto, and OM system cameras have the option to keep warm color on or off, and I have that set to off. And that's just kind of a all-in-one super control panel view of what I see when I turn to C1 on my mode dial. But I can also change what the buttons do. And this is another tip that if you have a camera that lets you change what the buttons do, I suggest that you do that. Because there are features that you might use more often than the default features put there by the manufacturer, so you can change them. And you can change that per custom mode. So I have my ISO button, because I always shoot ISO 200, or 99% of the time. I have that set to magnify my view so I can get a closer look. The AF on button is for back button focus. I have buttons set for focus bracketing and focus stacking. I have a button set for focus peaking, and I have a button to toggle that simulated optical viewfinder on and off. And that's what they look like. So even though the buttons are labeled with one thing, I know because I decided that they do another. All right, I've said these words a few times already. I don't mean to, hide what they mean if you don't know what they mean already, but focus bracketing and focus stacking. And these are two terms that people often kind of use interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. They do go together, but focus bracketing is varying focus from shot to shot. So you're taking a series of photos, you're bracketing, which means varying from shot to shot where the focus is, and it's usually back in space. So it's the same as if I took a shot here, I took a shot here, I took a shot here, I took a shot here. You're slowly moving focus through space away from your camera. And then stacking, focus stacking, is merging the in-focus areas from all of those shots together to create an exaggerated sense of focus. Okay? So the benefits of focus bracketing is really to give yourself a better chance of hitting focus because, maybe you're not sure. So you're like, I'm just going to get focus in a couple spots and I'll pick later. But usually it's because you want to make a stack and you need all of the in-focus areas throughout a bracketed series to make that stack. And you can bracket in a number of ways. You can do what I just demonstrated. You can physically move from shot to shot. It's challenging, it's not so scientific, but it can work, especially for 2 or 3 shots. You can use like a focusing rail where you incrementally adjust the focus and your camera slightly moves or your focus shifts from shot to shot. That's a method. You can do it with software. Software like Capture One can determine those increments for you and how many shots you need, but you need to be plugged into a computer to do that. Or with a camera like the OM1 Mark II or the OM1 or many of the other OM system cameras, you can do it automatically in camera. So back to the title of today's presentation, doing this the easy way, to me, there's nothing easier. And when you want to talk about easy, we can also automate focus stacking. So focus stacking is blending the in focus areas from all of those photos in the series. And we can do that with software. I use software called Helican Focus. You can use Photoshop. There's Arene Stacker. There's software that does it. But you can also do it at the press of a button in camera, and it's incredible. It does have a couple of limitations. You can't shoot as many shots as you can with pure bracketing. The results kind of are what they are, but they tend to be really good. And if your requirements fall within those limitations, nothing is easier or more convenient. So this is an illustration of what I kind of just demonstrated, where if you can imagine that rather than me moving from shot to shot, the series of photos in the bracketed series is just adjusting focus. So I stay still, and I can actually demonstrate kind of how it works. You're not going to see the focus shift, but I'm just going to focus on the front of my subject, like I just mentioned to answer the question. I'm going to press the button, and you're going to hear and see the camera fire multiple times. So with each shot, focus is shifting back into space. And I'm going to show you what that looks like on screen in just a second. And a lot of people don't realize, oh, you can focus bracket with a flash? Well, I just did it. In fact, because I have an Olympus flash or an OM system flash, the camera and flash are communicating, so everyone is equally exposed. And sometimes people will say, oh yeah, when I shoot with the in-camera focus bracketing, it shoots a couple, and then there's like a 1 second pause, and then it shoots a few more, and then there's a half second pause. Like, I think something's wrong. That's your camera and flash talking to one another saying, we need time to recycle so the exposures are equal. Otherwise, you would get some underexposed frames, some blacked out frames, and it's useless. So that's actually working as intended, and it's really, really helpful. Okay, I know that these are small on the screen. I'm going to zoom in on them so you can see. But this is a series, a medium series of 16 photos of a polished lady beetle. And the focus on the top left is closest to us, and on the bottom right is furthest from us. That's what the focus stack looks like, okay? And that's what it looks like up close. But the idea here is that you take a bunch of photos that some of them they all kind of look out of focus. But when you put the in-focus areas together for all of them, you get a result like that. And then this is a more zoomed in look at an example, because I know these were tiny. So this is Jumping Spider, Putnam's Jumper, and I shot 20 frames at f6.3 to make the shot on the right. That's stacked. On the left is 1 frame out of that series. So a single shot at f6.3 would yield the result that you see on the left. But I wanted more in focus. So I used 19 other frames with different focus points to get that enhanced, exaggerated sense of focus. And then here's a closer look so you can see more of that what's in focus, what's out of focus. The eyes are in focus here, and like that's a cool shot. But I think it's cooler when it looks like that. Okay, and I mentioned that the OM cameras have the option to do all of this in camera. So that was bigger series, especially, well, yeah, both were more than 15. So 16 images, 20 images. I used software to do that after the fact. I leveraged the in-camera bracketing feature, press the button once, take a bunch of photos, go home, put them on the camera, make my final. But you can also do this in camera as long as it's less than 15 images. So you're going to focus where it says initial focus. Depending on your working distance, it's going to come back in space a little bit. So you're going to kind of focus on what has to be in focus. And for me, that's still usually the front. So going back to that question earlier, I still like to focus on the front even though I know focus is going to shift backwards. First shot is that initial focus, back in space, and then a series through the subject out into space. Okay, so you can see up to 15. So that's why the order is out of order. And then here, you can see this animation of that happening. And I'll play this again. So each of those frames is going back into space after the initial, right? So I'll go back again and play that one more time. Play, maybe. There we go. So we see focus shift back just a little bit, and then we're moving off into space. Okay? So each shot kind of looks a little out of focus, but each shot has something in focus. This is the magic of what I said cannot be more convenient or easier, because right out of camera, you get an image that looks like that, with everything merged together in focus. And I got to take advantage of that, let's go back to what it was, I forget, f4 aperture, which gives me that soft background that we talked about, right? So when you want bokeh, but you also want depth of field, how do you do it? You use focus stacking. And there's the result again. And so I say processed in Lightroom here. It's a JPEG out of the camera. But by processing it in Lightroom, I'm simply, adjusting my contrast and things a little bit, but it's not really processed. It's already processed in camera.
They're asking how do you get the spiders to sit still? Because you're really in there, so just a little bit of movement is a massive shake.
Yeah, so how do I get the spiders to sit still? And I laugh because they're not dead. They are all alive. But there's two answers. One is I don't, right? They move a lot. I just don't show you those photos. I show you the ones when they stayed still. It takes a lot of trial and error. I miss a lot. They move a lot. I move sometimes. But with enough practice and enough patience, you can find those short windows of opportunity. Realistically, to make a stack like that jumper, I needed that spider and myself to stay steady for like 4 seconds. So you're just looking for that window of time where you can get in position and everything comes together, and then the spider can move and you can reframe.
They're asking if you use treats.
Treats for the spiders? If I could find treats that made the spiders stay still, I would definitely do it. We got a question here? Go ahead.
I would use the telelens in the case of the spider.
The what?
Telelens?
Oh, a telephoto lens.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'd be afraid to go too close.
Yeah, so that I mentioned, people say, how close do you have to get to the spiders? Like I showed you earlier, that working distance, it's pretty close. So here's our spider, here I am. So if you are afraid of spiders, this is not for you. You can certainly use telephoto lens to get closer. But again, if you're looking at a telephoto lens and want to get these extreme close-ups, look at those two specs. Look at minimum working distance or minimum focusing distance, if that's what's listed in the specs, and maximum magnification. So macro lenses are going to say 1x or 2x, right? But a telephoto lens is still going to say, it might just say 0.2x, which is 20% of reality. So if you want a telephoto lens that's going to give good close-up results, look for one with a close working distance and a high relative magnification.
They're actually asking if the strobe stuns the spiders or anything like that.
Yeah, so people ask that. I've never seen it happen. I've actually read some scientific studies about this because I have gotten the question where the consensus is that there's no negative impact from a flash on insects or spiders. So, okay. All right, on to sample photos. I never know if this is going to be everybody's favorite part or the most boring part, but I love showing my photos and talking about them. So I have, I think, 8 photos to talk about. Most of them are pretty new. So this one I just shot about a month ago. And this is a grasshopper. It is a single frame shot. So I'll always indicate to you whether it's a single shot, one frame, or if it's multiple frames blended together as a focus stack. This is a single frame shot. Important to note here, that's f10. If you are not used to macro photography, you might think, f10 can't give me bokeh. It can when you are 5 inches away from your subject, because working distance has decreased, therefore depth of field has also decreased, okay? 1/100th of a second, I use the flash, and that is the result. Another jumping spider. So this is on a blade of grass. Jumping spiders are very, very small. I mean, there's some bigger species, but most of them are very tiny.
So this is a pretty good question. They're
Yep.
asking if the recycle on the strobe keeps up with focus stacking when you're at tight apertures like f10.
Yeah, so that's why you want to make sure you use a flash that is compatible with your camera. So, I can guarantee it with the Olympus flashes, they're engineered that way. There are some third-party flashes that are compatible, but when you're doing a series for bracketing, you turn on bracketing in the camera, that sends the signal, hey, we have to coordinate flash and camera to pause enough. So the question was, does the flash recycle keep up? And it will slow down, especially if you're using high power. If you're shooting at a 30-second of full power on your flash, it's going to keep up fine. 16th, pretty good. 8th, maybe slower, right? If you're using full power, you are going to get a delay, but it will never give you blacked out shots. It's always going to give you equal exposure. So it will always work. It just might slow down. And there was something else I wanted to say about that, but now I am forgetting. Batteries. So when you use a flash, in order to keep your recycle speed short, you want to use really good batteries. So you want to look for a rechargeable battery that's high power, high output. Your regular AA's that are disposable, you're going to burn through those really quickly. So get good rechargeables. All right, so this jumping spider, very tiny. This whole spider could easily fit on my pinky fingernail. It's on a blade of grass there. This is shot at f9, single shot, f9 1/100th of a second again. And one more single frame before we get into a couple stack shots. So this is a robber fly. They're a larger fly. They're pretty big insect relative to like a house fly. This shot I was really proud of, and I felt like it was a real testament to my camera's image stabilization, my lens's image stabilization, maybe my own practice had something to do with it. But I shot this on my toes, reached out with one hand like this. This is not a stable position, and I'm able to get a shot that's razor sharp. So I feel like that was a little bit surprising, but also I was hoping for it, right? I knew the camera could do it, and if I could stay just steady enough, the camera would do the rest. But this shot's super sharp, even though I was not in a steady position. Okay, on to some stacks. So this is a little tree frog, a Stoffers tree frog from Costa Rica. I shot this with the 90 macro, 1/80th of a second. Some people think that's so slow, I'm going to get motion blur. You're not if you're using a flash, because your flash is helping to stop that movement. ISO 200 again. This is 15 frames stacked in camera. So I set the camera to focus stacking. I press the button one time. It goes 15 shots. 3 seconds later, magic, this is what I've got, okay? So when I talk about that really nice JPEG production out of the camera, there's virtually no post work in this. I might have just adjusted the highlights or the shadows a little bit to my liking, but this is what came out of the camera and you're done. So really nice, really convenient. For whatever reason, I feel like focus stacking works really, really good on frogs. I'm headed to Panama in a couple weeks on a trip, and there's gonna be lots of frogs, and I'm really excited to use in-camera stacking for those. And here's me shooting that shot. So that's just my foam diffuser, free homemade diffuser. There's a little tiny frog that you can barely see, and hand holding the shot as always, and that was the result you saw just before. Also in Costa Rica, this is a Weevil, 10 frames in camera. This whole shot, including the post work, took about 5 seconds, okay? Found the Weevil, turned on focus stacking, took the shot, JPEG comes out of the camera, and it's all done. And here I am pointing to that Weevil. So you can see it is very tiny, but we make it look really big.
Can you focus stack to a TIFF file in camera?
You cannot. Yeah,
JPEG only?
The only option for in-camera stacking is a JPEG. The question was, can you shoot to a TIFF? You can't, but the good news is when you shoot focus stacking, if your camera is set to shoot in RAW, you do get all of the RAWs from the series. So if you shoot 15 frames, it spits out a JPEG, you still get the 15 frames. So you can take those RAW files, process them to your liking, you can export TIFFs, you can merge them in Helicon Focus or Photoshop, and you can still do what you want, but the out-of-camera result for the stack is a JPEG. Here's another type of robber fly. It's a much smaller robber fly known as a gnat ogre. This is, that's what they're called.
You bug guys, man.
Yeah, I know. So this is F11, but it's 6 frames. So earlier I showed the grasshopper. That grasshopper was shot from the side. When you shoot from the side, everything's kind of on the same focal plane, right? So you don't need as much depth of field. You can get away with one shot or maybe a bigger aperture. When you go head on and you want that depth, now I'm using 6 shots, and I did stack this with helical focus. Here's a wolf spider peeking up from the grass. This is 92 frames. So this is when the question of how do you get the spiders to stay still, this can be a challenge. Luckily, some wolf spiders, under certain conditions, are pretty motionless. Like they kind of stay still for a while. You might have a minute where they don't move, and then they move over here, and then you shoot again. This was an instance where I needed that spider to stay still for probably 15, 20 seconds while I shot that series of 92 frames. But when it all works out, you can get really cool shots, and that's the result, f7.1. And I believe my last photo in the samples here is just last week. So this was a praying mantis. My neighbor found this and said, hey, there's a mantis. I said, I'm going to take some photos. It's a Carolina mantis, native to Pennsylvania, East Coast, New York. And it's preening its leg, so that's its own leg that it's kind of holding across its face. And that's a single shot again. So 1/100th of a second, but f14. Little bigger subject, I'm in pretty close. I need a little more depth of field. f14. And then I don't have me shooting it, but I do have my daughter with the mantis on her head. So that was a good time for all of us. All right, last few minutes here, we're gonna get into some tips. I probably have 20 or 30 tips, which I would consider good macro tips. I tried to give you 5 that you can take away and use right away. First up, this is usually high on everybody's list for field macro. It's get out early. This time of year, it is getting colder where we live here, but anytime, especially in the summer, go out early. Insects are ectotherms. They require the heat to move. When they're cooler, they're slower. So you'll find dragonflies that are just kind of waiting to dry off from the morning dew. But morning dew can make your photos look really cool. So you get slower subjects, and you get this element of, a dynamic element that you can add to your photos. Patience. Patience, patience, patience. Patience is a virtue. We've all heard it. This is one that you can apply to any photography, but as has come up a couple of times tonight, and as I've mentioned, you're going to miss a lot. And that is because the nature is unpredictable. The subjects don't want you in their face. Things can go wrong. You're working with millimeters, fractions of a millimeter of error, room for error. So you really got to be patient, but it will pay. Aim for the eyes. Not just the eyes, the front plane of the eyes, especially if you are shooting single shots. For a focus bracketed series that you're going to stack, you of course want to get the whole eye and maybe more. But just like with a portrait of a person, if the eyes are out of focus, the whole shot looks ruined. This shot that's here in the example, most of it's out of focus except the front of the eyes. And to me, it's still a success because the important part is in focus, okay? So really remember to obsess over focus and focus on the eyes. Get low. With insects and spiders, you notice that a lot of my shots are from the ground, or even the ground up. That is an unusual perspective for most people. If you're 5 feet, 6 feet tall, your eyes are up here, you look down. You've seen insects and spiders, but you've seen them from your vantage point. Get into their world, take the photos from their world, and you can make more interesting results. And in this one, the last tip is going to take you out of the field and back into your house or into the classroom or into the studio and practice. So many people, myself included when I got into this game, want to go out and find the cool subjects and make the cool photos. But if you don't practice with inanimate subjects, things like this, Legos, acorns, things on your tabletop to learn how your camera works, understand the functions, work with a flash, see what focus stacking, learn how to focus stack, all these things, do it in a completely controlled setting, fail there so you can succeed outside. And finally, one bonus tip is have fun. It will keep you sane because it is very easy to get discouraged when you're missing shots or you're sweating and the bugs are flying away and you can't find anything. For me, when those things start to happen, I realize like, hey, I'm out for a walk, I'm out in nature, I'm doing something I like, and as long as you're having fun, you'll never have a bad day. And that is that. Thank you. There's my socials and my website. Feel free to say hi anytime, and if we have a few minutes, I'll take questions.
Anybody?
Right here.
When you're shooting dozens of sequences, are you using a tripod?
No tripod. So some people are surprised by that, and I will say that the steadier the better. So I'm not saying don't use a tripod, but I'm saying I don't use a tripod because I like the freedom of being able to move from shot to shot. The spider's here, I set up my tripod, I shoot it, it goes over there, well now what, right? Like I gotta pick this whole thing up and move over there. So instead, I've focused my practice on getting in stable positions and learning how to stabilize myself and set myself up for success without the tripod. For single shots, the flash is gonna help you tremendously. If you've never shot macro with a flash, I highly recommend getting one. Like that was the biggest game changer moment for me because you don't need to be as stable as you probably think. But for series of shots, you do have to be stable because if you're moving, those shots won't align. So that takes a little bit of practice and fieldcraft.
They're asking, what about ring lights?
Yeah, ring lights. So this question comes up a lot. There's nothing wrong with them. Ring lights have gotten really popular in the last couple of years with the rise of Zoom calls and conference calls and blogging, right? So there's ring flashes and ring lights. So it's essentially a donut, right? And you have flashes that go at the end of your lens or it can go around. The reason I don't like them is mostly because of the shape of the catch light. So if I go back in here, jumping spiders, okay? See how that catch light in the eyes, it's this shape. If this was a ring, you'd get these beady white donuts 4 times across the face, and it doesn't look as natural, it doesn't look as good. So because you're so close to your subjects and you're getting a reflection of your light, the shape of a ring isn't really something that I like.
It's also way harder.
Well, I don't want anything to be hard. This is supposed to be everything the easy way.
No, like
to me,
hard light.
Oh yeah.
It has a hard look to it.
Yeah, it would be a little harder to diffuse it too. So this diffuser serves that purpose of softening the light and shaping the light in a pleasing way.
And Kathy's asking, have you ever used the 150 to 400 for macro? Jeez.
So I like the question. The question is, have I ever used the 150 to 400 for macro? I didn't mention that lens. Clearly the person asking the question knows about the lens, maybe owns it. That falls into the category of a telephoto lens with pretty good magnification and a pretty short working distance. That's a Pro Series lens. It is not a cheap lens, but it's a pretty good lens. It's a really good lens. And if you have it, I suggest looking at its minimum focusing distance, practicing in that range, use the focus limiter so you're not accidentally focusing on something in the distance, and go out and look for dragonflies. Go out and look for butterflies. I was just shooting with the 150 to 600 recently, which is similar, right, in range, 150 to 400, 150 to 600. And I was shooting things like bullfrogs and dragonflies and butterflies at that minimum working distance, which is really great because not only do some people not want to get close to these subjects, like if you're afraid of spiders, but some subjects don't want you getting close to them. So it's almost impossible to photograph a monarch butterfly in the middle of the day from 5 inches away. They're just going to fly away. So if you can get 4 feet away, you can still kind of fill your frame with that subject. So not really true macro, but something that I do like to do, and I definitely recommend experimenting with.
All right, well, guys, if you like this, go ahead and subscribe because there's more of this. You can hit this. Oh, no, I'm out of frame. Oh, there we go. Right there.
That thing.
Hit that QR code. There's a year of these on backlog on this channel. If you're new to this one, this is not Adorama TV. This is Adorama Events, so all the live demos come out of here. want to thank Chris and OM System for putting this on, and all you guys for hanging out with us. And, you know, you can clap for the guy. It's really, there you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.